Do you consider yourself a fan of Batman? Are you just casually interested in his unique story? Or do you worship at the shrine of the brilliant and cunning Dark Knight? Well, no matter how big of a Batman fan you are, there's a bigger fan out there. A fan of Batman whose devotion has gone so far that he has actively put Batman in danger just to watch him in action. A fan named Bat-Mite. But aside from being Batman's biggest fan, he's also the most dangerous. But exactly how dangerous and how powerful is Bat-Mite? Well, today, we're gonna find out just that. Welcome to Singularity. Before we can really understand Bat-Mite's powers, we have to understand where he came from, which means we need to understand the four eras of comics: the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Modern Age. The Golden Age was the birth of many of the most popular heroes. Superman, Green Lantern, Captain America all came from the Golden Age, and they were often used as propaganda for real-world events. It was common to see these superheroes punching Hitler or fighting the Axis powers. But eventually, comics moved away from these political, propaganda-like storylines. Then came the Silver Age. And this is the one that really matters. Around 1956, concerned mothers started questioning if comics were really appropriate for children. Up to this point, comics weren't really governed and could pretty much do whatever they wanted. Early Batman comics from the Golden Age showed him dropping villains out of helicopters with nooses tied around their necks. So in fear of being restricted by the government, a group of comic lovers and creators wrote the Comics Code Authority, a list of rules that comics had to conform to before being printed. That's right, for once it wasn't the government putting restrictions everywhere, it was the community. And these rules made for some really formulaic plot lines. Rules like, in every instance good shall triumph over evil and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Or, if crime is to be depicted, it shall be sordid and unpleasant. So this self-governing gave rise to more fantastical storylines to avoid violating the code. Stories like Superman fighting life-size alien ants, or Batman wearing a different color suit every night to distract from Robin's injury. The Comics Code is where these things came from. They even tried to print a series for the Joker during this time, but the Comics Code dictates that at the end of every issue, the criminal must be punished. And it would get really boring really fast to just see Joker dragged off to Arkham every issue just to break out again next month. Oh, and fun fact just by the way, you can actually buy the Rainbow Batman Collection action figures. They're super expensive, but if you're into that, there's a link in the description. But after a decade and a half of wacky hijinks, readers were starting to get tired of it. So comics creators and readers led a revolt to have the Comics Code abolished. And they won. The Silver Age was over. Stan Lee was actually instrumental in this. It's a great story that we just don't have time for, but that's linked in the description as well. So, with the Comics Code gone, the Bronze Age of comics began. Comics returned to a slightly darker tone, the moral lines of good and evil began to be blurred, and serialization grew in popularity. Then the Modern Age came. From 1985 to the present day, ensemble casts, anti-heroes, and more complex and twisting narratives have dominated the landscape of comics. So what does any of this have to do with Bat-Mite? Well, Bat-Mite was born out of the craziness that was the Silver Age. Let me explain. Spurred on by the popularity of a character called Mr. Mixtius-Pitalik, the writers of Batman wanted a similar character. So they devised Bat-Mite, a fifth-dimensional imp with seemingly unlimited power who was completely obsessed with Batman. He would often pop in and create danger just to watch Batman in action. And while this was fun and fitting for the Silver Age, once the Bronze Age rolled around, Bat-Mite just didn't fit in anymore. So following the continuity-wide reboot, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Bat-Mite was pretty much forgotten about. Ignored by the writers because he didn't fit with the theme anymore. He did, however, make one more appearance as Batman's counselor. Long story short, Bat-Mite was retconned into being a figment of Batman's imagination all along. And when Batman lost his moral compass and went crazy, Bat-Mite, as a figment of his imagination, counseled him back to health. Before departing, Batman asked him if he was ever real or just imaginary from the beginning. Bat-Mite's response? The fifth dimension is imagination. So we're left with a really messy narrative where we don't know what's real and what's not, and a character who has unimaginable power. So let's start by finding a high-end feat and scaling from there. Most of his feats are standard reality warping, which, while very impressive, don't really lend themselves to power scaling. While a character who can lift a building is clearly stronger than a character who can lift a car, there's no real way of measuring reality warping. Fortunately, we do have one major asset: World's Funnest. In World's Funnest, Bat-Mite and Mr. Mxyzptlk get into a fight over which of their heroes is better. This fight ends up destroying literal multiverses. The pre-crisis multiverse, the post-crisis universe, Kingdom Come, The Dark Knight Returns, and the DC animated universe all get caught in the crossfires, and a winner's never really declared. So great, we're done. Bat-Mite is a reality-warping, multiverse-level threat who can extinguish entire infinite sets of realities at his will. Except, World's Funnest is technically classified as an Elseworld, which means its canonicity is in question at best. So we're back to square one. See, the problem that we will always face with power-scaling reality warpers is that it's difficult to put limits on their powers. We could say that they're universal or multiversal, planetary or galactic, but at the end of the day, we just can't find any hard and fast limits. They can quite literally change the very nature of the universe that they're in. That's what fifth dimensional means. We are fourth dimensional beings, 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. And a fifth dimensional being like Bat-Mite can control us and our surroundings just as easily as we could draw on a 2-dimensional piece of paper. That's how dimensional physics works. We have infinite power over any dimensions under us. But hold on a second, if that's true, what's with Mr. Mxyzptlk's rules? He's a 5th dimensional imp too, so he should have infinite power over our universe. So how does he even have rules, and why are they so arbitrary? I'm sure we'll get to it later, don't worry. As long as we're talking about dimensional physics, there's another way of looking at Bat-Mite's power. Let me ask you a question. Who is more powerful, you or Superman? Superman can bench press the weight of the planet for 5 days straight and literally punch a hole in reality. But you can rip the page. Generally, when we discuss how powerful a character is, we mean in-universe. But that neglects the given. They exist in a universe that we created. Think of any amazing or extraordinary feat in any comic book ever. Now go out, purchase that comic, and flush it down the toilet. Congratulations, you just became more powerful than whatever character performed that feat. That's the thing about characters like Bat-Mite. They're just characters. As multiversally powerful as Bat-Mite is, he's really completely powerless. He's just a drawing on paper. He's just an idea. But ideas do have power. The study of ideas and how they spread is called memetics. Memetics treats ideas, or memes, the same way that genetics treats genes, as irreducible building blocks. From simple things like the color blue or the feeling of hunger, to more complex ideas like color theory or love. Memetics is the study of these memes and how they spread. And how these memes spread is what's important to us today. Because one of the central ideas of memetics is that once a meme is shared, it takes on a life of its own. A teacher in the US posted a picture of herself holding a piece of paper to demonstrate to her class how once you post something, it's out there for everyone to see. It went about as well as expected. And that's the point of memetics. No matter who comes up with the idea, once it's shared, it's for everyone, and it becomes a lot bigger than you. This picture of Mixiospitalik explains it a lot better than I can. So here's an interesting question. Who's more real? You or me? But the answer is obvious, you might say. Except it isn't. How many people know your name? 100? 1,000? 5,000? How many people have seen your face and recognized it? Less than you think, I bet. I was created as a character in 1944. Think about that. Millions of people have known my name. Millions of people have seen my face. About half of them are probably already dead. But here I am. Oh, I suppose I don't have a physical body in the same way you do. But does that make me any less real? I don't need a body. I've lived on, and will live on, in heads. The heads of the authors who write about me. I have no vocal cords, and yet, right now you're hearing my voice. I'm living in your head right now. But ideas have no agency. Wrong again, of course. Ideas are agency. We are gods. You are just puppets. As long as there's one of you, there'll be 100 of us. You're holding this comic, reading it, and you think you're in control. But you're so weak, you can't even pronounce my name. Go ahead, try it. And when you think of me later, in a minute, in an hour, in a day, or a month, or a year, I'll be alive again. And yet I can promise with absolute certainty that I will never once think of you. It's all nonsense, of course, but it's an interesting question. There is one other view to consider, because as powerful as ideas are, that power comes from what they represent, their symbolism. And Bat-Mite represents us, the fan base. I know we haven't spent much time talking about Bat-Mite up to this point, but I think you'll find that everything we've talked about is important to understand this last bit. If it wasn't obvious enough from him being a Batman fanboy, in 1979, in a story titled Bat-Mite's New York Adventure, Bat-Mite visits the actual DC Comics main office and demands to be included in an upcoming Batman story. Picketers are seen outside the building holding signs saying, "We want Bat-Mite," and the writer of the comic said that this was meant to parallel the real-world demand for Bat-Mite. The fans wanted more Bat-Mite, and so he appears demanding to be included. Need more proof? Remember Batman the Brave and the Bold? The final episode of that series starred Bat-Mite fighting Ambush Bug, who we just don't have time to discuss, over whether or not to cancel the show. Bat-Mite had gotten tired of the show, love letter to the Silver Age that it was, and wanted a darker, more realistic version of Batman. Sure enough, the next Batman series to air was Beware the Batman, a darker, more Bronze Age take. Who wouldn't get tired of the Silver Age after a while with its arbitrary comics code? Wait a second. Fifth-dimensional beings like Mixiospitalik and Bat-Mite have rules. But just like the comics code, those rules are self-imposed, sometimes entirely arbitrary. Mixie says it himself, he makes up the rules when he visits our dimension. The only reason Superman saying his name backwards sends him back to the fifth dimension is because that's the rule that Mixiospitalik came up with. And just like the comics code, those rules are sometimes entirely arbitrary. In the TV show Supergirl, Mixie couldn't even make someone drink orange juice. It's not that he didn't have the power. He could force people to drink orange juice just as easily as we could draw a character drinking a glass of orange juice. It's that he restrained himself. And if the fifth dimension really is imagination, well, then it all comes together. Because the only limits to our imagination are the ones that we put there. Bat-Mite is more than just a powerless drawing. He's more than just an idea. He's us, a representation of the fans of comic books. Just like Bat-Mite can change reality with the snap of his fingers, we can change realities with our enjoyment, our judgment. After all, the MCU would not exist as it is if we hadn't loved Iron Man. DC characters like Sideways, Damage, and Red Lion wouldn't exist at all if we didn't love Marvel characters like Spider-Man, Hulk, and Black Panther. Remember Death in the Family that killed off Jason Todd? That never would have happened if it weren't for us, the fans. Despite any other way you want to measure Bat-Mite's power, whether you want to view him as a god who can destroy multiverses, or just a drawing that you could rip just as easily as taking a step, his true power comes from his representation as a fan of Batman. And just like us fans, the only rules that he has are the ones that are self-imposed onto him. DC and Marvel would have gone out of business long ago if we, as fans, didn't keep them alive. Bat-Mite's true power is our power.